So my path to purpose started with something I think we can all relate to, a friendship. This is my friend Madiha. I met Madiha in 2000 when we were graduate students in New York City studying international affairs. Madiha was born in Bangladesh, and she grew up all over the Mideast, settled in Singapore, and went to high school there, and had a peer group from around the world. And from the day I met her, I was so drawn to Madiha's effortlessly global worldview. She seemed to be able to make connections between history and contemporary events so easily. She seemed to be able to move seamlessly through different cultures, new groups of people. She seemed so at home in the world. And we were also bonded by our affinity for education as the great leveler. We were the daughters of educators, and we believed that education was really the bedrock, the foundation for any thriving society. So despite having really different upbringings, Madiha and I developed this close friendship. And we entered our second year of graduate school in the fall of 2001. And on September 12th, 2001, we woke up to a world that had been changed irrevocably from the acts of terrorism on 9/11. And while the world grieved and mourned and worked to support and lift one another up, there was also a darker narrative at play, a xenophobic backlash that was affecting people like my friend Madiha because she was Muslim. She was kicked in the shins on the bus. She was called a terrorist in public. And this was the first time in my life I was in such close proximity to someone that I loved, in a city that we both loved, to be the target for such hateful rage in such an intensely personal way. And it made me angry. But it made Madiha more empathetic. She understood they were afraid. And it turned our conversations into contemplations about how it is that we develop our worldview, how we come to relate and understand one another. And so our purpose really became understanding how is the world changing and how are we preparing for it. And change isn't a new thing. Things have changed since the beginning of time, but it seemed to be the accelerating pace of that change, that things seem to be changing faster and faster, bringing us people, places, events in all corners of the world into closer connection even faster. And we wondered in 10 and 20 and in 50 years what that was going to mean about how we had to be prepared for that. And more than that, what should it mean about education and the future of learning so that young people could be prepared for that? So there were really three things that were setting context for our understanding about how was the world changing. The first was a pretty simple question. Who are we? Our demography. The United States in 1970, an 88% white population, with so many of the ethnic and racial groups that are now thriving in our country, too small in number to be measurable in some senses. Advance 40 years to 2010, and you see a pretty dramatic shift. The white population declines to 75%, Black and Hispanic population rises to about 24% collectively, and you see other groups being represented. Now let's project ahead to 2050 and imagine the composition, what we predict to be what our country will look like. We see an almost complete turnaround. In my lifetime, we'll have gone from an 88% white population to a 47% white population, less than half. By 2042, no single racial or ethnic group in this country will comprise a minority. And this change isn't just happening in Texas and California and in New York. It's happening in Colorado and Indiana and Minnesota and North Dakota. Diversity is our common future. And so we asked ourselves, what does that mean about how we have to live and work together? And how are we going to engage in community in solving problems? And so if population statistics feel rather far away from your personal life, not so sticky, consider what it means about communities that'll be in transition, thinking about how to accommodate this, how to grow with this. In 2008 in Minnesota, the Somali population was one of the largest outside of Somalia. And there happened to be a lot of Somali cab drivers. And Somali cab drivers had expressed an objection to picking up seeing eye dogs, guide dogs, based on religious beliefs and preferences. And at the same time, ADA regulations protect people with disabilities from discrimination. So even though you couldn't regulate every interaction between when a cab picked up an individual, at places like airports, you found the city and community with two protected rights in conflict without a clear right answer, like so many challenges we face. Doesn't have a clear right answer. So imagine what it takes for a community in this kind of transition to address that. Cross-cultural communication, empathy, comfort, openness, valuing multiple perspectives, and cultural and religious difference. The second thing that Medea thought about with me that anchored this changing world was how we were working. How was business changing? Mom and pop to multinational were now connected to, inextricably linked to, a global economy that was rapidly changing. 1 in 5 jobs in the United States currently is tied to international trade. And that statistics has increased by triple-digit percentages in so many states in the last couple of decades. It also changes the landscape for how businesses do their work. Your consumers change, your supply chain changes, how you engage your employees changes. And again, if international trade statistics are a little bit too removed from your day-to-day life, imagine the things you do every day that connect you to this reality. So if you've used your iPhone or had a cup of coffee today, by show of hands. So in 2012, Apple produced 170 million products, more than 90% of which were manufactured outside our borders. And the cup of coffee you had this morning was produced by a network of 25 million workers, 90% of whom are in the global south. So there are pedestrian ways every day without thinking that you affect and are affected by this global economy that connects us all. The third thing we considered were the nature of our problems and challenges in the 21st century. How were they changing? What did they look like? And really what characterized them was the complexity and connectivity. They seemed to be becoming more borderless, affecting people and places and events everywhere. And as a result, there were more issues that seemed to have global causes and global consequence, and that would now require this unprecedented level of working together, cooperating together across borders. This is Bangladesh, where Medea is from. Bangladesh is one of the countries most severely impacted by the impacts of climate change, in particular rising sea levels. Bangladesh is about the size of the state of Iowa, and it has half the population of the United States of America, 160 million people. By 2050, scientists estimate that 17% of Bangladesh will be underwater. So for a moment, I'd like you to imagine taking half the population of the United States, moving them to Iowa, and then flooding 20% of it. So by 2050, as a result of this, they anticipate that 18 million people will be without homes, farms, livelihoods, and up to 50 million people will have nowhere to go. They will need somewhere to go. Climate change was not caused by one country, nor can it be solved by one country. It's an example of the kinds of challenges we find ourselves facing in the 21st century. Global causes, global consequences, requiring unprecedented levels of cooperation. So knowing what we knew about this global reality and understanding how is the world changing and how is it distinguished, we asked ourselves, what are we doing? Surely we've kept pace with this change and we're preparing students to learn in a way that's appropriate. It won't come as a shock to very many of you that for the last 100+ years, we've had more or less an industrial schooling approach. The world has changed, but education has not changed very much along with it. Most schools and classrooms are a place where my grandparents would be very comfortable walking in, feel very nostalgic. So even though the tools and the technology have changed, we have smartboards, we have iPhones, we have iPads, they're applied to a very similar structure. You still have the same length of school day, the same length of the school year. You still have students arranged in desks looking up to the front of a room where a teacher's delivering content. You still teach subjects in specific siloed disciplines, science and language arts and math, even though most of the problems you'll face outside the classroom walls require interdisciplinary thinking. And probably worst of all, we've oriented teachers towards teaching to prepare for a test that doesn't measure any of the skills and dispositions that are needed to thrive when students graduate. We've oriented our entire education system towards building good test takers instead of building good thinkers and good problem solvers. So knowing this was the reality, Medea and I thought, well, what should the future look like? How could we envision an education system that would actually adequately prepare young people for this future? We founded World Savvy in 2002 to do just that. And we thought about the purpose of education, to prepare our young people to be engaged citizens in our communities and in our democracy, to be able to be contributing members of the workforce in our economy, and to be able to be problem solvers that would be able to address local and global issues that affected our health and our security and our well-being of people and of the planet. And we thought, what should education be doing? What kind of preparation is necessary? And it's global competence. It's the ability to equip all students with the knowledge and the skills and the dispositions to thrive in an interconnected and interdependent global society. So imagine for a moment, if students were allowed to learn in diverse teams, tackling complex problems, using interdisciplinary thinking, envisioning solutions, and putting them into action. Imagine if they had agency in determining what and how they learned core subject matter and were drivers of their own education in the process. And imagine if we were able to support teachers, not to think about how to align what they taught to a test, but to facilitate that journey for students, building engaging, real-world kinds of curriculum. And imagine if we measured what mattered. Imagine if we measured the skills and dispositions that we know students need to solve those problems, to navigate our more diverse communities, to be prepared for that more global workforce. World Savvy worked with a classroom in California that was interested in global sustainability. It was a math class. So their teacher let them choose a question, something that would drive their learning and their exploration, something they wanted to discover that was personal to them. So they chose, how much trash does our school produce in a given day? So they started with the global context of the environmental impact of waste and consumption. They looked at the cultural and social implications of how communities around the world are disproportionately affected by waste and consumption. And they looked at root causes. And then they applied basic core principles of geometry, of ratio reasoning, of statistics to get their answer. They divided up into small teams. They canvassed this large campus. They found every trash receptacle, and they ran the calculations necessary to determine the volume of trash. They brought back that data, they aggregated the data, and then they decided to depict it by drawing large-scale replicas of these trash cans and including all their conclusions and their data in those trash cans, and then positioning them in the lobby of their school to inspire shock and awe and action among their peers. So teaching for global competence and learning core subject content, they're not mutually exclusive. These students were learning problem solving, critical thinking, research, communication, presentation skills. They were using math and science and social studies and the arts. And they were taking what they learned and they were turning it into some meaningful action to engage people in discourse, to something that mattered to them, that gave them ownership over what they learned. And perhaps most fun, as a result, this was engaging for students. This was fun for students. And most importantly, it mimicked what we might ask those students to do in the real world to solve a problem. This is my daughter, Aggie. She's 2. When Medea and I began our vision 12 years ago, and it began to grow, and World Savvy began to grow across the country and across the globe, nothing has reaffirmed my purpose more than becoming a parent. Because Aggie's going to grow up in this world that we envisioned together, that is rapidly changing, that is more globally and interconnected and interdependent every day. And by teaching and learning for global competence, we can actually create the conditions for an education system that is forward-facing, that prepares my daughter and all students for the future. And imagine the possibility if we could do that. Groups of young, engaged global citizens who are solving complex problems across borders with people from all backgrounds. Young people who were approaching change and ambiguity with openness and empathy, even when they were afraid. Young people applying creativity and ingenuity to the problems that we don't yet have the imagination to conjure in 2014. That's the kind of education system that I want for my daughters and I want for all kids. Because our only hope for a more just, equitable, and sustainable future is by preparing our young people. Thank you.